Now let's take a look at the labor system of the South during Reconstruction. So before the Civil War, the economy of the South was an agricultural economy that was heavily based on slavery, right? Slavery created the whole social structure. You have the large planters, which had, the big plantations that were mass producing cash crops, and they owned a number of slaves. You have small white farmers who may own one slave or two slaves, or may not have any slaves at all. And then you have African Americans, free African Americans, which were a smaller population in the South. And then you have African American slaves, right, who were the primary workforce in the South. So that was before the Civil War. But now, after the Civil War, during this period of Reconstruction, what's the labor system like? How does it work? Well, you have a number of white planters who used to be quite wealthy, now poor. They're impoverished. And why is that? It's because of the effects of the war. Okay? A lot of farm equipment was destroyed. People who had domesticated animals, their animals may have been killed by the army, right, who needed to feed its soldiers. Or maybe they were just killed to destroy the economy of the South, right? The Union did that quite often, right? Buildings destroyed, infrastructure destroyed, like I talked about earlier. So you have a number of white planters not doing so well after the war, okay? And then you have a number of African American workers after the war who don't own land because, like we said, President Johnson decided to give land that was confiscated or land that had been abandoned back to the original owners rather than distributing it to African Americans. Okay, so what does this labor system look like now? Okay, so the white planters who used to be on top of the social hierarchy, they still are, but they're not quite as wealthy as they once were. You have something called the task system in some areas, such as in South Carolina and Georgia, where you have a number of rice plantations and you have large African American populations in those states. The task system had been in place for a long time, going all the way back to the colonial period. And basically, what this is it's a labor system where workers are given tasks that they need to complete in that day. And as soon as they complete those tasks, the rest of the day they have free time. They can do what they want to. They can tend their own crops or crafts or whatever they need to do. And so that system was kept in place in South Carolina and Georgia. So that's one type of labor system. You have a number of African American wage laborers who are still working within the task system during Reconstruction. But another form of labor that was taking place was something called sharecropping. What is sharecropping? Well, since many African Americans didn't receive land after the Civil War, they were forced to rent land, oftentimes renting land from their ex-slave masters, right? And so you have a number of African Americans living on the same plantations where they were once slaves, or maybe where their ancestors were once slaves, and they're practicing sharecropping. Okay, so what is sharecropping? All right, so what this is where you're renting land, right? And you're growing crops. Well, all the crops that you grow, out of all the crops that you grow, 50% of them go to the landlord, the guy who you're renting from, the guy who owns the land. And so there's a problem with this, with sharecropping, is it leads to a cycle of poverty, okay? Because you're never able to make a real profit on the crops, especially during the period of Reconstruction. Why? Because the price of agricultural products had dropped dramatically after the Civil War because of the global economy. Because the South had stopped producing, items like cotton that used to be shipped out worldwide, so other countries started producing those products to make up for that loss because it's not coming from the South during the Civil War, and because of that, there's too much product on the market now, and since there's like a large supply of various products like cotton, which used to bring in a lot of money, because there's a huge supply, the price goes down. Okay, that's how economics work. If there's a large supply, the demand goes down. Start charging less because there's too much competition. Okay, and so sharecroppers were not able to make a big profit because 50% of what they're growing has to go to the landlord. And so, how are you going to make enough money to buy your own land and become self-sufficient? It's not possible. Another economic arrangement that's similar to sharecropping that took place in the South is something called the crop lien. Okay, so you had a number of small white farmers in the South who used to be somewhat self-sufficient, right? They were able to sell their crops on their little farms and create crafts that they needed, and they were able to pretty much live on their own. But because the economy is in shambles and the global economy is dropping the prices on farm products, they don't have enough money to get the things that they need, such as like farming equipment or furniture or whatever they need for their house or for their farm. Okay, so they got to take out loans, right? These small white farmers, they got to take out some loans to get some money to get the stuff they need. So they're going to go to a bank, for example, and take out a loan, and the bank wants to be assured that they're going to get paid back, right? And so how do you ensure the bank that you're going to pay them back? Well, you offer up a portion of your crop. And what are you going to be growing that's going to bring in a lot of money? Well, a lot of small white farmers didn't grow cotton. That was more on the plantations. Before, they used to grow other things, to feed their family, just regular foodstuffs. But now you start seeing a shift during Reconstruction where a number of small white farmers would be growing cotton now because it's a cash crop. It brings in some more money, right? And so you have a number of white farmers turning to growing cotton, and then part of that crop that they're growing has to go back to their creditors, to a bank or whoever's loaning the money. And in this case, you owe the bank, right? Or you owe the creditor. And if you can't pay them back, guess what happens? You lose your land. Okay? And so you have a number of small white farmers who went into debt, they lost their lands, they couldn't pay back the loans, and then they become sharecroppers, right? So they're also stuck in that cycle of poverty. Okay? So this all leads to a new social hierarchy in the South. You still have the white planters at the top of the social hierarchy, right? They're still the most wealthiest, even though they took a big hit after the Civil War. Now you have a large free African American population in the South, and many are sharecroppers. Many African Americans are also wage workers, right? Working for wages for a white employer, maybe in agriculture, maybe in business, another type of business, maybe in industry. In some of the southern cities, you do have a little bit of industry that's developing. You also have some entrepreneurs in those cities as well. That's a part of the whole social hierarchy. They're on the rise as well. And then you have small white farmers, many who are losing their lands or having to become sharecroppers because the economy is not doing well, especially in the agricultural sector. Now let's take a look at the first phase of Reconstruction in the South. This is a period of 2 years, from 1865 to 67. This is known as presidential Reconstruction. Why? Because it's the policies of the president, Andrew Johnson, that heavily shaped the direction of Reconstruction at that time. President Johnson was a strong believer in states' rights. Okay, the argument of states' rights versus federal rights, right? The rights of the federal government. He believed that the federal government should not intervene in issues that should be left to the state governments in the South. Okay, so what are some of the policies of President Johnson that shaped Reconstruction during these 2 years? Well, for one, this is huge, he gave pardons to all white Southerners in the South, right? Even though the South was in rebellion against the United States, he pardoned all white Southerners, except for leaders of the Confederacy, okay? But, eventually, those leaders would also get pardons as well. There wasn't like a big, blanket pardon like he had done for all white Southerners, where if you were white, if you were a Southerner, you got pardoned. You had no punishment, basically, is what I'm saying. But the former Confederate leaders were given individual pardons, right? So like each individual is given a pardon on an individual basis. You see, over time, and so that basically leads to no punishments for anyone who was involved in the Confederacy or in the rebellion, right? No punishments. Just like, okay, it's over. Let's not go there. Let's just have you guys get reintegrated back into the Union, right? And it took time, right? The Southern states were not officially back in the Union just yet. They didn't have representatives in Congress yet, right? But they're getting there. Now that everyone's been pardoned, and they've been given back their political rights in terms of like within their state and local governments, and they have voting rights, now they could recreate governments there in the South. So when elections came up during these 2 years, who do you think was voted into office? The traditional leaders of the South, right? The planters, the wealthy, the influential. they got voted back into office, and many of these were former Confederate leaders. Okay, and so they're back in positions of political power due to the policies of President Johnson, because he gave everyone a pardon and he gave them back their voting rights, their political rights, their legal rights. And so, what does this lead to now that these individuals are back in power? Well, it leads to a number of repressive laws that restrict the freedoms of African Americans. And these are known as the Black Codes.